Hello, I'm Bob Evnen, Secretary of State for the state of Nebraska. USLGE is a nationwide organization that represents the very best of livestock genetics across the United States. Dairy, beef, sheep, swine, horse, and goats. We've produced this series of videos for you to learn more about the U.S. genetics marketplace and the steps we can take together to improve the genetic power of your herds to produce a better final product. After you've taken a look at these videos, for more information, please visit the USLGE website or give USLGE a call. I'm Nebraska Secretary of State Bob Evnen. I think that you'll find this video very interesting. Thanks for watching.
Hello, I'm Dr. Chris Calkins, a meat scientist and professor in the Animal Science Department, Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska. I'm delighted to visit with you today about how the genetics and production systems we have in the US and in Nebraska give rise to really high quality beef. In fact, that product is so good that not only do we add value to the regular steaks, but there are some opportunities to upgrade value in some of the lesser desired parts of the carcass, and we'll talk about that value addition. I'm standing next to a beef carcass right now. The head would be here toward the bottom. These are the ribs, and then the hind quarter of the animal is up above. When we think about steaks, we always think of high quality steaks coming from the loin and the rib regions. And that, in fact, of course, is true. We generally think of the chuck as having less value because there are fewer steaks. If you think about a large animal that needs to walk, it has to raise its arm, move it forward, set it down, and generate enough force to move 1,700 pounds of animal. Some of those muscles are working very hard and are not very tender. But some of those muscles just do this. They're not working that hard, and they are opportunities to add value to beef carcasses. When you have the right genetic makeup and the right production system, we're able to take advantage of that and turn what would otherwise be a chuck roast into a high quality steak. I'll demonstrate that for you in just a moment. I would point out that first of all, we will look at the beef clod, which is right in this region. We can think about that as being right over the shoulder blade of the animal. In addition to the beef clod, right underneath that is a product we call the chuck roll. And that primal also has some great opportunities for adding value. Let's get started. So we begin first with the beef shoulder clod. That's that outside part of the shoulder that I spoke about earlier. This would be the outside surface. And inside, you can see that there are a variety of different muscles. And these muscles give opportunity for upgrade. You know, traditionally in animals, this whole piece was made for ground beef. And while ground beef is good, it is one of the lower value items that we could make. And so part of our project was to determine, are there diamonds in the rough? Are there opportunities to identify muscles that we have been undervaluing and add value and increase the value of those carcasses and those animals? It turns out the answer is yes, if you start with the right product to begin with. And so there is a muscle that lies right on the inside here. It's fairly easy to get to. Again, prior to our project and study of these particular muscles, this was a muscle that was just put into beef trim, used for ground beef. This muscle, however, when it's cleaned up, so we'll just trim off this fat from the outside surface. This muscle is called the Petite Tender, or sometimes people will call it the shoulder tender. It's a very nice sized muscle. You can easily cook it on the grill and then make medallions. And so here we have a steak quality muscle that was being used for ground beef prior to this. Once we remove the petite tender, the next muscle is this muscle complex right here in this region. Here we can follow the natural seams, and by separating this piece will become our flat iron steak. Many of you have heard about that. It is the second most tender muscle in the carcass. But again, prior to our project, this was a muscle that was typically used for hamburger or roast. I'll just set this aside for a moment. On the inside is this soft tissue. That goes right next to the shoulder blade. And on the outside, I've already started to remove some of that fat that's on the surface, the subcutaneous fat. Now, on the inside, we just remove that extra tissue. I think you can see that if we just took the time to trim this a little bit, that it would make a very nice, attractive roast. However, much of the time it gets sold as a roast or ground beef, or I want to demonstrate, sometimes butchers will just cut right in the middle. And when you do that, you can see that there's a very thick seam of sinew right in the middle of that steak. As a result, this steak was being sold, but at a very low value. It turns out, if you remove that sinew and you just keep the muscle itself is quite tender, more tender than a ribeye steak. That is unrealized value. And as long as you have the right genetics in the animals that you're working with, then you'll end up with a high quality product. So in this case, I'm going to save the good stuff and remove that sinew. We do lose a little bit of yield, but the increase in value from these flat iron steaks make that a worthwhile effort. Now, what we can actually do is we can separate out that sinew from the entire piece and not have to cut steaks like I did. And when I cut those steaks, I just simply wanted to demonstrate for you what those steaks would look like if you cut them across that sinew. But instead, if we just take a moment and separate that sinew out of the middle of this steak, then we end up with a kind of a thin, flat piece of meat, and on the other side, we'll trim out that sinew, get rid of it. There we are. So now, in this case, you might think, well, that muscle is too thin for a steak. I like my steak thicker than that. This muscle is unique, this flat iron, because when you put it on the grill and cook it, it will actually plump. It gets thicker. And so you can start out with a very tender piece of meat and make a very nice, desirable product. These are the flat iron steaks that you see here, here, and so on. Now, I've cut these about 3 or 4 ounces in size. They could go up as high as 6, 8, or even 10 ounces if someone wanted that much product. So now we have the remainder of the shoulder clod. We removed the petite tender, we removed the flat iron steak, and there's a very large muscle here, not surprisingly, called the Clod. It's really the heart of the clod because it's right in the middle of it, and in fact, that's the nomenclature we use. It's called a clod heart. Now you'll see that we're also trimming off extra fat, extra trim, and this could easily be used to make ground beef, and the extra fat would be discarded. There's also a natural seam on one end. So by doing that, we end up with a very nice pot roast. And so this pot roast, similar to the chuck roast that we would think about, that we would normally make, but in this case, we've also got this Clod heart to deal with. So here, once again, we remove the tough tissue on the outside. So just a little bit of nice work, and you see we have some very attractive lean product beneath. This is a cut that typically was sold as a roast. In fact, I like to say that the way beef was used to be cut before we realized the real sensory qualities of this muscle was kind of hunk and chunk. We would cut chunks of meat and sell it as a roast. But in fact, there's far better opportunity on this product. So we'll just clean it up on both sides. And then you'll notice there's a tendon on this side. And so that tendon actually, this muscle is made in two pieces. And in one part, the fibers go this way. In the other part, the fibers go this way. And they lie on top of each other. So that if we just started cutting steaks now, sometimes we'd cut across the grain, sometimes we'd cut with the grain. And whenever you're cutting meat, it's always better to cut across the grain. That's going to give you a better eating experience. So the best way to do this is to separate these two pieces apart. So I'm just following that natural seam between those two parts of the muscle, as you can see. Once we've done that, once again, there's an opportunity to get rid of that extra tissue, that extra sinew, in this case, an extension of the tendon itself. And now we're left with some pure, lean meat. Now, if you don't have the right genetics, the right production system, the right animals, then this is a product that is best, in fact, used for something like a roast or ground beef. But in our case, because we have that great genetic background, this muscle is more tender and has better eating quality than what many people recognize. And so I will just take a few minutes and create these steaks. These are called ranch steaks. Ranch steaks are intermediate in tenderness and value. Think of it something like a sirloin steak. They also take marinades really well. So if you wanted to marinate for flavor or for taste or even for tenderness, then that's a possibility as well. So if you look, there's just a lot of possible ranch steaks here that I've managed to pull out for us. All of these would normally be sold as ground beef. Anytime you can sell it as steak, the value increases. So out of this beef shoulder clod, we have been able to get a long series of ranch steaks. We've been able to cut flat iron steaks. We have a petite tender, and we have a pot roast. So a very large upgrade in value compared to what we would normally find if we were to just take that shoulder clod and grind it. So that's one example of how we can enhance the value of the beef that we produce here in the United States. So out of that beef shoulder clod then, instead of having just a few chunks of roast, or instead of just creating ground beef, we actually have 4 distinct different items. We have our beef shoulder tender or petite tender, we have our flat iron steaks, we have a pot roast, and we have our ranch steaks, all of which adds value to the product. And now let's take a look at the beef chuck roll and see what we can get from that product that will add value. Next up, we have the beef chuck roll. In this case, the head would be on this side, and the secret is that this side right here connects to the ribeye. Now, it's kind of an arbitrary cut where we separate the ribeye from the chuck roll. Think about that. So the steaks that come off in this region are right next to the ribeye steaks. Do you think they taste like ribeye? Yes, there's a lot of very similar characteristics there. So we have an opportunity right away, instead of just using this for a roast, to create some special steaks from the ribeye end of the chuck roll. Those are called Delmonico steaks or chuck eye steaks. They're great value and great eating as well. So what we'll do is we will begin to separate the muscle just as if the ribeye were continuing all the way forward. And we'll separate a chuck eye roll from this underblade portion. So let's get started and do that right away. In this case, I'm just separating the same muscle complex that we would do if, in fact, we had the ribeye and we didn't stop the ribeye when we removed the chuck. So it almost is shaped like a log. Whenever you're cutting meat and you can hit a seam like that where everything just falls apart, you know you're in the right spot. So this gives us, well, frankly, it looks a little bit like a ribeye, to be honest with you. And so there was actually a project done where we took and cut steaks the entire length. And then we gave the steaks to chefs and we said, kind of like the limbo rock, how low can you go? How many steaks can we get before the muscles change over and they don't taste like ribeye anymore? The answer is 3. So we can cut 3 1-inch steaks from the end of this chuck eye roll. And these 3 steaks look a lot like ribeye steaks. And you know what? They taste a lot like ribeye steaks as well. After that, the muscles have changed and we have to find different uses for these products. Now, we could just create a roast out of the rest of these. If I were to ask you, what roasts can you think of that you can dry, heat, cook in an oven? Many people say, well, prime rib. And then after that, the list is really short. The beauty is, this portion of this chuck eye roll can in fact be dry heat cooked. It makes awesome roast beef. So it's already a step above chuck roast and way above ground beef. There's another product that's very popular. It's called Boneless country-style chuck short ribs. Think about when you get short ribs, everybody wants the piece with the big meat on it and the bone is kind of incidental. This is the boneless version of that. It's kind of a little trick to cut it. Instead of cutting 1 inch, we cut 2 inches thick. Here's the secret. We turn it sideways and we split it down the middle. Wouldn't you agree that would be a very meaty, flavorful, succulent chuck short rib? Boneless country-style chuck short ribs. I will just cut a few of these so that you can see what they look like. Again, very popular item, especially in the summertime. It is a short rib, so it needs to be braised or cooked with a little moist heat cookery, but you can finish on the grill and get wonderful flavor and succulence. Now what's left, we could make more boneless country-style short ribs, but because I want to show you another alternative, this can be sold just as a roast by itself. Look at that, nice, lean roast, right? And in fact, this is called America's beef roast. So out of the chuck eye roll, that top portion of the chuck roll, we got 3 Delmonico steaks, boneless country-style short ribs, and America's beef roast. Next, we have the remaining portion of that chuck roll. Earlier, I referred to it as the underblade. it would be under the shoulder blade, under the ribs. And you can see there's a very attractive piece of meat, lots of high marbling on this side, fourth most tender muscle in the carcass. Again, often sold as a chunk of chuck roast or as ground beef. We know there's more value than that. This is a very interesting muscle because it fans out like the fingers of my hand. So if you're going to try and cut it, you will have to be careful that you're always cutting across the grain and not cutting with the grain. It means we have to spend a little bit of time trimming up and cleaning up this product. The other thing about this particular piece of meat, in addition to this underblade portion, there's also a flat muscle here that's very coarse in texture, and in fact, it looks a lot like a flank steak. It is not a flank steak, but it is the next best thing. It has very similar properties and can give us a very similar flank steak type eating experience as well. And flank steaks, it turned out, partly because we don't make very many of these, are very popular. And so selling this flank steak rather than as ground beef or as roast item is actually a value upgrade as well. So in this case, it's called the Sierra cut. And you can see it's got, I'll trim this off so you can see a little more clearly. There's a very coarse texture to it, which makes you think and makes it look a lot like flank steak. So this particular cut then, sold as a flank steak replacement, is a great opportunity to add value. And then lastly, we have this muscle that I talked about that tends to lie next to the ribs. We just take a little time to trim off the extra connective tissue that's here. And then out toward the end here, it just gets a lot narrower, a lot thinner. So once you get out to the end, you can go ahead and just cut that loose. This will become part of our ground beef mix. On the inside, we begin to separate that tissue as well. Well, you can see the marbling that's present there, that fat within the muscle that really gives it great flavor and tenderness as well. Remember when I talked about how it fans out like the fingers of your hand? So that you can see there are the fingers of the muscle in this location. Because I've removed this piece, we now have a very nice squared up piece that can then be cut into steaks. These steaks are very flavorful, fourth most tender muscle, as I mentioned before. And in fact, we call these Denver steaks. And so Denver steaks offer another opportunity to dramatically increase the value associated with this beef chuck roll. You can see lots of rich marbling, great succulent flavor, and a good return, a good fair amount of steaks that are located there. We could do some other things with this piece. For example, if we split it in the middle and then split it down the center. And we also have a very nice little piece that can be sold as well. So a lot more value associated with this chuck roll than just roast or ground beef. So briefly, in summary, what we see is from the top portion of that chuck roll, which we called the chuck eye roll, we have Delmonico or chuck eye steaks, we have boneless country style rib, America's beef roast, the Sierra cut, and then we have these Denver cuts as well. Dramatic increase in value. Now, just like we used to tell people when you do things that are a little bit risky, we always use that phrase, don't try this at home. The secret is you can't do this unless you begin with the right quality of animal. The animal that has the right genetics that can convert the feedstuffs and the production system to which it's subjected into high quality beef and give you these kind of products. A great way to add value, a real win for consumers, because consumers get great tasting, great quality products they can readily identify. And of course, that's good for everyone involved in the entire production chain. If you have any question, visit USLGE website or contact me directly, Dr. Chris Calkins, University of Nebraska. Thank you.